The courtroom was packed, its heavy silence pierced only by the occasional shuffle of papers and the soft murmur of spectators waiting for the case to unfold. Judge Naomi Lawson sat at the bench, her dark eyes scanning the room with a sense of calm that contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. She had presided over countless cases in her career, each one adding another layer of experience. But today was different. Today, she could feel it. Something was about to unfold that would test her more than she could have ever imagined. As the courtroom doors swung open, the sound of footsteps echoed down the aisle, drawing the attention of everyone present. Officer James Mitchell, a rookie police officer just out of his training, strode confidently into the room. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid with the kind of youthful arrogance that only someone who had recently been given authority could possess. His face, still sharp with the remnants of youthful inexperience, held a look of intense determination, though there was an underlying arrogance in his eyes that seemed to challenge everything around him. The room fell into an uneasy stillness as Mitchell approached the defendant's table, ignoring the reverent gazes of the court. He was aware of the whispers, the glances from the gallery. It wasn't hard to tell why. As the only black female judge in this court, Naomi Lawson had earned respect, but she had also earned her share of critics. The world outside the courtroom had made sure to remind her of that every day. It was this undercurrent of tension, this clash of backgrounds, identities, and expectations that made Mitchell's presence in the courtroom feel even more charged. Mitchell didn't seem to care, his gaze fixed firmly on the judge as he approached the front. He had heard the rumors, of course, the whispers about Judge Lawson's authority, her decisions, the old-fashioned methods she was known for. He didn't believe them. To him, she was just another judge. And this particular case, was important enough to him that he would not let it be decided by someone who he believed was stuck in the past. Judge Lawson observed him closely as he took his seat, the young officer's eyes not meeting hers as he sat down. She had seen his kind before, overconfident, too eager to prove something. But what unsettled her more than his youth or his arrogance was the look in his eyes. A sharpness, a challenge. It was as though he was daring her to question him, to test his resolve. The case was about a routine matter, an officer-involved shooting that had left a man seriously injured, but Mitchell's involvement was not as clear-cut as it seemed. He had been the first officer on the scene, and his actions were under scrutiny. The defense team had raised questions about his judgment, but it was his conduct in the courtroom that was starting to raise alarm. Judge Lawson took a deep breath, steadying herself as the trial began. She knew the stakes. This case was high profile, and the courtroom was filled with reporters, legal analysts, and spectators eager to see how it would unfold. Mitchell's eyes flicked towards her, but she refused to acknowledge the challenge he was presenting. She had faced more difficult cases than this, more difficult men, but something about Mitchell rubbed her the wrong way. He didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation, or worse, he didn't seem to care. "Officer Mitchell," Judge Lawson said, her voice steady but firm, "please proceed with your testimony." Mitchell stood, his hands tucked behind his back as he faced the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice laced with an unshakable confidence. "I was the first officer on the scene. I followed protocol and took immediate action. The situation escalated quickly, and I had no choice but to respond in the way that I did." His words were rehearsed, each sentence calculated to show his professional standing. He spoke with the kind of certainty that made it clear he had already decided that his version of events would be taken as gospel. But Lawson could see through the bravado he was making assumptions. He was treating her like a mere formality, a woman whose authority could be dismissed with a few well-placed words. "Officer," Lawson interjected, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You've mentioned protocol. Tell me specifically what actions you took in accordance with department policy. And did you consider all available options before deciding to escalate the situation?" Mitchell's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected the question to come so soon, nor with such precision. He glanced at his notes, gathering himself for a response. "I followed protocol, Your Honor," he repeated, but his voice faltered slightly. The way she had asked the question, direct, sharp, and without hesitation, reminded him of something he had long since tried to suppress: respect. He wasn't used to people questioning his actions, least of all someone like her. "You followed protocol," Lawson echoed. "But did you think? Did you stop to consider the humanity of the man you were dealing with? Did you look past the uniform and see the person standing before you?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Mitchell's face flushed, his hands tightening into fists behind his back. He didn't like this. He didn't like being questioned like this, especially not by someone who, in his eyes, was out of touch with the modern world, someone who had been sitting in a courtroom for too long, far removed from the streets where he patrolled. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Judge Lawson's gaze locked onto his. "Officer Mitchell, I understand the pressures you face," she said quietly, but her voice was unmistakably firm. "But the truth is, you're not here because of what you think happened. You're here because your actions need to be examined. And right now, the only thing that's in question is your ability to remain objective." A cold shiver ran down Mitchell's spine. He had heard about Judge Lawson's reputation, how she didn't tolerate disrespect, how she demanded the best from those who stood before her. But this was different. This was a challenge he hadn't expected. His mouth went dry as he sat back down, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. Her calm, unflinching gaze bore into him. Was she testing him? Or was this something more? The question echoed in his mind, louder than anything else. Was she trying to break him? The courtroom felt smaller now, the tension thickening the air. Mitchell had made a choice when he entered this courtroom. He had chosen to challenge the authority of Judge Naomi Lawson. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had made the wrong decision. As the trial continued, Mitchell found himself unable to shake the feeling that something much larger was at play. The more he pushed against Judge Lawson, the more she seemed to remain calm, her every word precise, deliberate, and calculated. There was no sign of vulnerability in her. He couldn't see it, and it made him nervous. Outside the courtroom, the murmurs continued. People were talking not just about the case, but about the growing tension between the rookie officer and the seasoned judge. What was really going on here? What would happen next? And then, just as the session was about to adjourn for the day, Judge Lawson stood and addressed Mitchell directly. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice cool but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I suggest you think carefully before you challenge my authority again. There are consequences to every action in this courtroom, and sometimes those consequences are far greater than you can imagine." The words hung in the air like a warning, their weight unmistakable. The rookie officer didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of something that would change both their lives forever. The days that followed the tense exchange in the courtroom were filled with a growing sense of unease. Officer Mitchell had returned to his precinct, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts. For the first time in his young career, he found himself questioning his decisions. Judge Naomi Lawson's calm yet unyielding presence had unsettled him. It wasn't just the challenge to his authority, it was something deeper, a nagging sense that he might not fully understand the game he had just entered. Despite his discomfort, Mitchell tried to shake off the encounter. He had dealt with tough situations before. What was one obstinate judge compared to the challenges he faced on the streets every day? But the more he thought about the courtroom, the more the memory of Judge Lawson's gaze lingered. Her words had been simple but cutting. She hadn't just questioned his actions, she had questioned his judgment, and it had stung in a way he hadn't expected. Back in court, Judge Lawson's demeanor remained unwavering. Every day she came to the bench with the same calm and controlled air, but underneath, there was an undercurrent of something more. She was acutely aware of the weight of her position. She had fought hard to get here, and she knew that people, especially young officers like Mitchell, would be looking for ways to challenge her. She had no illusions about what her presence in the courtroom meant. Being a black woman in such a high-ranking judicial position meant that she was always scrutinized, always under pressure. But she had learned long ago how to handle it. As the trial continued, the tension between Mitchell and Lawson grew. Mitchell's arrogance never wavered, and he became more aggressive in his questioning. He ignored her rulings, raised his voice when she made decisions he disagreed with, and frequently questioned her reasoning in front of the jury. It was becoming clear that Mitchell was not only defying her authority in the courtroom, he was challenging her personally. The air in the room crackled with the intensity of their standoff, and the spectators could feel the mounting pressure. Everyone was wondering just how long this would go on before something gave. Judge Lawson, for her part, kept her composure. Each time Mitchell challenged her, she responded with measured calm, always in control of the situation, never losing her temper. She had seen this behavior before. Young men with something to prove, men who felt the need to show their superiority, whether it was in the streets or in the courtroom. She had spent her life battling against such attitudes, and she wasn't about to let this rookie shake her confidence. Mitchell, however, was relentless. The more she resisted, the harder he pushed. He began to question her decisions in public, during breaks in the trial, speaking to colleagues and reporters about how he felt the judge was out of touch with the realities of policing. He talked about how judges like Lawson were more concerned with the process than with what really happened on the streets. He argued that the justice system was outdated, that the rules were holding back young officers like him from doing their jobs effectively. In the courtroom, his questions became sharper, more pointed. He used every opportunity to undermine her authority, testing her patience at every turn. Each time she spoke, he cut her off, challenging her with a defiance that bordered on disrespect. But Judge Lawson remained calm, though her inner resolve began to harden with each passing day. This was not just a trial anymore. It was becoming a battle of wills. One afternoon, the trial reached a critical point. Mitchell had just finished giving his testimony for the defense when Judge Lawson called for a recess. As the gallery filed out, she turned to Mitchell, her voice low but firm. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "I have given you every opportunity to maintain a level of professionalism in this courtroom. You have ignored my rulings, and you have attempted to undermine my authority at every turn. This is your final warning. If you continue in this manner, there will be consequences." Mitchell's face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. He couldn't understand why she was so determined to stand against him. Didn't she see that he was right? Didn't she understand that things were different now? The world had changed, and so had the police force. What was the point of sticking to outdated rules if they didn't serve the purpose of protecting people on the streets? He opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Lawson held up a hand to silence him. Her calmness was infuriating. It was as if she knew something he didn't, something that made her unshakable in her belief. "You think this is about authority, don't you?" Judge Lawson asked, her voice a soft whisper that nonetheless carried through the space. "It's not. It's about understanding what justice truly is. It's about making decisions that protect the people who come before you, not just following the rules because they're convenient. You're not just a figure of power, Officer Mitchell. You're a person with responsibility. And you need to start thinking about the consequences of your actions, not just the outcome you want to see." Mitchell stared at her, his mouth dry. She had struck a chord. He had expected a lecture, but this felt different. There was something about her words that made him pause. He had been so focused on winning, so consumed with proving himself, that he hadn't stopped to consider the bigger picture. But then the anger rose again. He couldn't let her think she had gotten through to him. He wasn't here to play games. He wasn't going to back down now. "This isn't just about you and me, Judge," Mitchell said, his voice sharp. "This is about the system. This is about the fact that the rules you're so eager to defend are outdated. They don't work anymore. They don't protect people like me. I don't have the luxury of being soft. You don't understand that." Judge Lawson looked at him, her expression unreadable. She had heard this before, this kind of rhetoric, the claim that things had changed, that the old ways no longer applied. But she wasn't ready to let him off the hook that easily. "I understand more than you think, officer," she said quietly. "But this trial isn't about the system. It's about your actions. And the system, whether you like it or not, requires accountability." There was a moment of silence, and for a brief second, Mitchell thought he saw something in her eyes. A glimmer of something deeper. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She turned away from him, signaling the end of the recess. As the trial resumed, Mitchell felt a shift. He couldn't shake the feeling that Judge Lawson wasn't just a judge. She was something more, something formidable. And for the first time, he wondered if he had miscalculated. The days that followed only deepened the rift between them. Mitchell continued to press his arguments, but they seemed to bounce off of Lawson's unshakable resolve. And yet, despite his frustration, he began to feel the weight of her presence. The more he fought, the more he started to question himself. He wasn't sure what he was up against anymore. Was it just the judge's unyielding authority? Or was there something deeper, something he hadn't seen before? The trial reached its peak with a dramatic twist that no one had anticipated. Mitchell made a decision, one final act of defiance, a challenge that would change everything. But what he didn't know was that his actions would lead him down a path he couldn't return from. Judge Lawson's next move would stun everyone in the room, but it would also reveal the true depth of the battle they had both been fighting. The trial had reached a point of no return. For days, the tension between Officer Mitchell and Judge Lawson had been palpable, escalating with every word spoken, every challenge laid down in the courtroom. Mitchell was relentless, pushing back at every opportunity. His arrogance had evolved into something more dangerous. He wasn't just challenging Judge Lawson's authority. He was testing her resolve, pushing her to a breaking point. But Judge Lawson, as always, maintained her composure. Each day, she arrived at the courtroom, her presence a steadying force that commanded respect, even from the most defiant of individuals. Mitchell had never been so determined in his life. He was so certain that he was in the right, so convinced that his version of events was the only truth. To him, Judge Lawson was an obstacle, a relic of an outdated system that needed to be swept aside. He had ignored her warnings, dismissing her challenges as nothing more than personal affronts. He had no idea what lay ahead, no inkling that his actions were about to set off a chain of events that would alter the course of the trial, and of his life, forever. On the third day of the trial's final week, something unexpected happened. As Mitchell prepared to present his closing argument, a quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. The defense lawyer, a seasoned veteran with decades of experience, stood up, a look of disbelief crossing his face. He turned to Judge Lawson with an expression that quickly shifted from confusion to realization. Something was wrong, very wrong. Judge Lawson remained calm, her expression unreadable as the defense lawyer passed her a folder. She opened it slowly, scanning its contents. For a brief moment, the courtroom held its breath. The document she had just been handed was the key to the case, the very piece of evidence Mitchell had been so certain would exonerate him. But what was in the file sent a chill down everyone's spine. The evidence was not what Mitchell had expected. In fact, it was the opposite. A key piece of surveillance footage that had been overlooked during the initial investigation had finally surfaced. Footage that contradicted Mitchell's version of events. There, in stark contrast to his claim that he had acted in self-defense, the video clearly showed Mitchell's actions escalating the situation unnecessarily. It showed him approaching the suspect aggressively, his demeanor anything but restrained. The evidence painted a far different picture than the one Mitchell had so confidently described in his testimony. The room fell silent as Judge Lawson looked up from the file, her gaze locking onto Mitchell. The impact of the revelation was like a punch to the gut. Mitchell's face drained of color as the full weight of what had just happened sank in. His arrogance, his defiance had clouded his judgment. He had believed in his version of events so strongly that he had overlooked the possibility that the truth might be something completely different. And now, here it was, staring him in the face, undeniable and damning. The defense lawyer cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Your Honor," he said softly, "this footage changes everything. It's clear that Officer Mitchell's actions were not in line with the department's protocol. In light of this new evidence, we must reconsider the charge." Mitchell stood frozen, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. This was the moment he had feared, the moment that would undo everything he had worked so hard to build. His career, his reputation, everything was hanging in the balance. But what was more terrifying was the realization that the very thing he had fought so hard to maintain, his sense of control, his confidence, had been shattered in an instant. Judge Lawson remained silent for a moment, her eyes never leaving Mitchell. It wasn't anger that she felt. There was no triumph in her gaze. Instead, there was something far more profound: disappointment. She had hoped that Mitchell would come to realize the importance of accountability, that he would understand the weight of his decisions. But now she saw the truth, that he had been blinded by his own arrogance, by his need to prove something to the world. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Lawson spoke, her voice steady and measured. "Officer Mitchell," she said, "you have spent this entire trial defying my authority, questioning my judgment, and refusing to acknowledge the impact of your actions. But what this footage reveals is far more than a mistake. It's a pattern of behavior. It shows that you were not acting in the best interests of justice, but rather in pursuit of your own agenda. And now, because of your refusal to accept responsibility, this trial will have to proceed in a way that you never anticipated." Mitchell's mind spun as her words sank in. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to argue that the footage didn't tell the full story. But he knew deep down that it did. There was no escaping it. The evidence was irrefutable, and his actions had been reckless. He had been too focused on proving his own righteousness to see the bigger picture. Now he was paying the price for his arrogance. But there was another layer to this situation, one that Mitchell had never anticipated. As the courtroom settled into a tense silence, Judge Lawson turned to address the rest of the room. This case has exposed more than just the actions of one officer. It has shown us the flaws in a system that allows individuals to operate without the proper checks and balances. We must ask ourselves, how many other cases have been shaped by the arrogance of those who are too confident in their own infallibility? How many others have been affected by those who believe they are above the law? The room was still as Judge Lawson's words echoed in the air. Mitchell, for the first time, realized the weight of what she was saying. This trial wasn't just about him. It was about the broader issue of accountability, of the dangers of unchecked power. It was about the need for individuals in positions of authority to recognize the responsibility that came with their power. As the day wore on and the proceedings continued, Mitchell sat in stunned silence. The reality of the situation was becoming clear to him. He had been given every opportunity to back down, to accept responsibility for his actions. But instead, he had let his pride and his arrogance lead him down a path that would now cost him dearly. And yet, amid the weight of his failure, there was something else, something unexpected. It was a sense of clarity. Mitchell realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that true strength didn't come from defiance. It didn't come from the need to prove oneself to others. True strength came from acknowledging one's mistakes, from accepting responsibility, and from learning from those mistakes. The final ruling came swiftly, but it wasn't what anyone had expected. Judge Lawson's sentence was fair, but it was also a lesson. Mitchell was to face the consequences of his actions, not just in terms of legal repercussions, but in the broader context of his career and his life. His actions had been reckless, but there was still room for growth, for redemption. The court's decision was a reminder that no one was above the law, no matter how high they climbed. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the trial, Mitchell stood and faced Judge Lawson. He was no longer the arrogant rookie officer who had entered the courtroom with defiance in his heart. He was someone who had learned a hard and painful lesson, a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Judge Lawson's gaze softened for the briefest of moments. She knew that the real challenge for Mitchell was just beginning. The consequences of his actions were unavoidable, but it was what he did next that would truly define him. "Officer Mitchell," she said quietly, "this is not the end. It is the beginning of your journey. What you do with this moment will determine the rest of your life. Make sure you choose wisely." And with that, the trial was over. The courtroom emptied, leaving behind a quiet sense of finality. But for Officer Mitchell, the journey was just beginning.